The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a shimmering blue canvas under the unrelenting gaze of the midday sun. The water sparkled like a field of diamonds, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of waves. Above, the sky was a flawless dome of cerulean, devoid of clouds, as if nature itself had decided to paint a picture of serenity. Yet within this tranquil setting, a drama was unfolding, one that would soon shatter the illusion of peace. Somewhere in this immense oceanic void, a commercial airliner, Flight 7014, was cruising at 35,000 feet, its engines humming steadily as it carried 247 souls across the globe. The aircraft, a state-of-the-art twin-engine jet, was a marvel of modern engineering designed to traverse vast distances with precision and reliability. But on this day, it would become the stage for an unprecedented and harrowing ordeal. Flight 714 had departed from Honolulu International Airport just over 4 hours, earlier bound for Auckland, New Zealand. The journey was routine, one that the crew had undertaken countless times before. The pilots, Captain James Mitchell and First Officer Sarah Bennett, were seasoned professionals with decades of combined experience. They had gone through their pre-flight checks meticulously, ensuring that every system was functioning perfectly. The fuel load had been calculated with precision, accounting for the distance, weather conditions, and potential diversions. Yet as the aircraft soared over the Pacific, far from any landmass, an anomaly began to reveal itself, one that would defy all calculations and plunge the flight into a life-or-death struggle. The first sign of trouble was subtle, almost imperceptible. The fuel gauges, which had been steadily decreasing as expected, began to show discrepancies. The numbers didn't align with the flight plan, and the rate of fuel consumption seemed higher than anticipated. Captain Mitchell, a man known for his calm demeanor and analytical mind, double-checked the calculations. He cross-referenced the data with the flight management system, but the anomaly persisted. The fuel was disappearing faster than it should have been. At first, the discrepancy was small enough to dismiss as a minor glitch, but as the minutes ticked by, the situation grew increasingly alarming. The fuel levels were dropping at an alarming rate, and the aircraft was still hundreds of miles from the nearest diversion point. The crew's training kicked in. Captain Mitchell and First Officer Bennett began running through emergency protocols, attempting to diagnose the issue. They checked the fuel pumps, the engines, and the fuel lines, searching for any signs of a leak or malfunction. But the systems appeared to be functioning normally. There was no visible damage, no warning lights, no indication of what was causing the rapid fuel depletion. The realization began to dawn on them. The aircraft was burning through its fuel reserves at an unsustainable rate, and there was no clear explanation for why. The Pacific Ocean below offered no refuge, no airports, no runways, only endless water. The nearest suitable diversion point was over an hour away, and the fuel would not last that long. As the gravity of the situation became apparent, the mood in the cockpit shifted from concern to urgency. Captain Mitchell contacted air traffic control, his voice steady but laced with tension. He reported the fuel anomaly and requested immediate assistance. The air traffic controllers, thousands of miles away, scrambled to coordinate a response. They began calculating possible diversion routes, but the options were grim. The closest airstrip was on a remote island, still too far to reach with the remaining fuel. The controllers advised the crew to prepare for the worst-case scenario, a controlled ditching in the ocean. The term ditching was a euphemism for a water landing, a maneuver that was fraught with danger and rarely attempted in commercial aviation. The success rate was abysmally low, and the outcome was often catastrophic. The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a shimmering blue canvas under the unrelenting gaze of the midday sun. The water sparkled like a field of diamonds, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of waves. Above, the sky was a flawless dome of cerulean, devoid of clouds, as if nature itself had decided to paint a picture of serenity. Yet within this tranquil setting, a drama was unfolding, one that would soon shatter the illusion of peace. Somewhere in this immense oceanic void, a commercial airliner, Flight 714, was cruising at 35,000 feet, its engines humming steadily as it carried 247 souls across the globe. The aircraft, a state-of-the-art twin-engine jet, was a marvel of modern engineering, designed to traverse vast distances with precision and reliability. But on this day, it would become the stage for an unprecedented and harrowing ordeal. Flight 714 had departed from Honolulu International Airport just over 4 hours earlier, bound for Auckland, New Zealand. The journey was routine, one that the crew had undertaken countless times before. The pilots, Captain James Mitchell and First Officer Sarah Bennett, were seasoned professionals with decades of combined experience. They had gone through their pre-flight checks meticulously, ensuring that every system was functioning perfectly. The fuel load had been calculated with precision, accounting for the distance, weather conditions, and potential diversions. Yet as the aircraft soared over the Pacific, far from any landmass, an anomaly began to reveal itself, one that would defy all calculations and plunge the flight into a life-or-death struggle. The first sign of trouble was subtle, almost imperceptible. The fuel gauges, which had been steadily decreasing as expected, began to show discrepancies. The numbers didn't align with the flight plan, and the rate of fuel consumption seemed higher than anticipated. Captain Mitchell, a man known for his calm demeanor and analytical mind, double-checked the calculations. He cross-referenced the data with the flight management system, but the anomaly persisted. The fuel was disappearing faster than it should have been. At first, the discrepancy was small enough to dismiss as a minor glitch, but as the minutes ticked by, the situation grew increasingly alarming. The fuel levels were dropping at an alarming rate, and the aircraft was still hundreds of miles from the nearest diversion point. The crew's training kicked in. Captain Mitchell and First Officer Bennett began running through emergency protocols, attempting to diagnose the issue. They checked the fuel pumps, the engines, and the fuel lines, searching for any signs of a leak or malfunction. But the systems appeared to be functioning normally. There was no visible damage, no warning lights, no indication of what was causing the rapid fuel depletion. The realization began to dawn on them. The aircraft was burning through its fuel reserves at an unsustainable rate, and there was no clear explanation for why. The Pacific Ocean below offered no refuge, no airports, no runways, only endless water. The nearest suitable diversion point was over an hour away, and the fuel would not last that long. As the gravity of the situation became apparent, the mood in the cockpit shifted from concern to urgency. Captain Mitchell contacted air traffic control, his voice steady but laced with tension. He reported the fuel anomaly and requested immediate assistance. The air traffic controllers, thousands of miles away, scrambled to coordinate a response. They began calculating possible diversion routes, but the options were grim. The closest airstrip was on a remote island, still too far to reach with the remaining fuel. The controllers advised the crew to prepare for the worst-case scenario, a controlled ditching in the ocean. The term ditching was a euphemism for a water landing, a maneuver that was fraught with danger and rarely attempted in commercial aviation. The success rate was abysmally low, and the outcome was often catastrophic. Inside the cabin, the passengers remained blissfully unaware of the unfolding crisis. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, their smiles masking the growing tension among the crew. The hum of the engines was a constant, reassuring presence, lulling many into a sense of security. Children played with their toys, business travelers typed away on their laptops, and a few passengers dozed in their seats. The atmosphere was calm, almost mundane. But in the cockpit, the pilots were grappling with a nightmare scenario. They knew that time was running out, and they had to make a decision that would determine the fate of everyone on board. Captain Mitchell and First Officer Bennett began preparing for the unthinkable. They reviewed the ditching procedures, a set of protocols that they had studied in training but never expected to use. The checklist was extensive, covering everything from securing the cabin to configuring the aircraft for a water landing. They knew that the success of the maneuver depended on their ability to execute it flawlessly. The aircraft had to be flown at a precise speed and angle to minimize the impact force. The landing gear had to be retracted to prevent the plane from flipping over upon contact with the water. The cabin had to be secured to ensure that passengers and crew were braced for the impact. Every detail mattered, and there was no room for error. As the fuel levels continued to plummet, the pilots made the difficult decision to inform the passengers of the situation. The cabin crew was briefed, and the announcement was made. The voice of Captain Mitchell came over the intercom, calm and measured, but with an undercurrent of urgency. He explained that the aircraft was experiencing a fuel emergency and that a water landing was imminent. The passengers were instructed to assume the brace position and to follow the instructions of the flight attendants. The announcement sent a wave of shock through the cabin. Panic began to ripple through the rows of seats as the reality of the situation sank in. Parents clutched their children, couples held hands, and some passengers began to pray. The once peaceful atmosphere was replaced by a palpable sense of dread. Outside, the ocean loomed large, its surface now a menacing expanse of blue. The aircraft began its descent, the pilots carefully guiding it toward the water. The engines, starved of fuel, sputtered and died, leaving the plane eerily silent. The only sound was the rush of air as the aircraft glided downward, its fate sealed. The pilots focused on maintaining control, their hands steady on the controls as they aimed for a patch of relatively calm water. The seconds felt like hours as the plane descended, the ocean rushing up to meet it. The impact was inevitable and the outcome uncertain. The moment of contact was violent and chaotic. The aircraft hit the water with a tremendous force, sending shockwaves through the cabin. Water surged into the plane, flooding the interior as the fuselage began to break apart. Passengers were thrown from their seats, and the cabin was filled with screams and the sound of rushing water. The flight attendants, trained for such emergencies, worked frantically to evacuate the passengers. Life rafts were deployed, and people scrambled to escape the sinking plane. The ocean, once a symbol of tranquility, had become a battlefield, its waves swallowing the crippled aircraft. As the survivors clung to the life rafts, the reality of their situation began to set in. They were adrift in the middle of the Pacific, hundreds of miles from land, with no guarantee of rescue. The sun, once a source of warmth and light, now felt like an unrelenting adversary, beating down on them as they floated in the vast, unforgiving ocean. The ordeal was far from over, and the fight for survival had only just begun. The life rafts bobbed precariously on the surface of the Pacific, small islands of hope in an endless sea of despair. The survivors of Flight 714 clung to the sides of the rafts, their faces pale with shock and exhaustion. The initial chaos of the ditching had given way to a grim silence, broken only by the sound of waves lapping against the rafts, and the occasional cry of a seagull overhead. The sun, now high in the sky, cast a harsh light over the scene, its heat relentless and unyielding. The ocean stretched in every direction, a vast, unbroken expanse of blue that seemed to mock their insignificance. There was no land in sight, no ships, no signs of rescue, only water as far as the eye could see. The rafts were overcrowded, designed to hold far fewer people than they now carried. Passengers and crew members were packed tightly together, their bodies pressed against one another in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. Some were injured, their wounds hastily bandaged with whatever materials were available. Others were in shock, their eyes vacant as they stared out at the horizon, unable to comprehend the magnitude of their situation. The flight attendants, trained for emergencies but never for something of this scale, worked tirelessly to maintain order. They distributed life jackets, checked for injuries, and tried to keep spirits up, but the weight of their predicament was impossible to ignore. Among the survivors was Captain James Mitchell, his uniform now soaked and disheveled. He had managed to escape the sinking aircraft, but the guilt of what had transpired weighed heavily on him. He replayed the events in his mind, searching for answers, for something he might have missed. The fuel anomaly, the rapid depletion, the desperate attempt to reach land, it all felt like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. He knew that as the captain, the responsibility for the lives on board ultimately rested on his shoulders. The thought was almost too much to bear, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the immediate task at hand: survival. The rafts were equipped with emergency supplies, but they were meager at best. There were a few liters of fresh water, some ration bars, a first aid kit, and a handheld radio. The radio was their only hope of contacting the outside world, but its range was limited, and the batteries were already low. Captain Mitchell took charge, organizing the survivors into groups and assigning tasks. Some were tasked with rationing the water and food, while others were assigned to keep watch for ships or aircraft. The radio was handed to a passenger with technical expertise who began attempting to send distress signals, but the vastness of the ocean worked against them, and the signals seemed to disappear into the void, unanswered. As the hours passed, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The sun beat down mercilessly, its heat sapping their strength and dehydrating them. The water rations were carefully measured, each person receiving only a few sips a day. The ration bars were divided into tiny portions, barely enough to stave off hunger. The survivors began to feel the effects of exposure: sunburn, thirst, and exhaustion. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a growing sense of desperation. Conversations were hushed, the mood somber as people grappled with their fears and uncertainties. Some prayed quietly, while others stared out at the horizon, hoping for a miracle. The ocean, once a symbol of beauty and freedom, had become a prison. Its waves, though gentle, were a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The rafts were at the mercy of the currents, drifting aimlessly with no way to steer or control their direction. The survivors had no idea where they were or how far they had drifted since the ditching. The vastness of the Pacific made it nearly impossible to gauge their location, and without navigation equipment, they were completely lost. The thought of being adrift for days or even weeks was a terrifying prospect, but it was one they had to confront. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and the survivors huddled together for warmth. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of the moon and stars. The ocean, so vast and imposing during the day, now felt even more menacing in the dark. Every sound, the creak of the raft, the splash of a wave, seemed amplified, feeding their fears. Sleep was elusive, as the survivors were too anxious and uncomfortable to rest. They took turns keeping watch, scanning the horizon for any sign of light or movement. But the night passed slowly, and the only thing they saw was the endless expanse of water. The second day brought no relief. The sun rose again, its heat even more oppressive than before. The water rations were nearly depleted, and the survivors were beginning to feel the effects of dehydration. Their lips were cracked, their throats dry, and their energy levels dangerously low. The ration bars were gone, and hunger gnawed at their stomachs. The mood in the rafts grew increasingly tense as the reality of their situation became harder to ignore. Some passengers began to lose hope, their spirits crushed by the enormity of their predicament. Others clung to the belief that rescue was imminent, that someone would find them before it was too late. Captain Mitchell did his best to maintain order, but even he was beginning to feel the strain. The responsibility of leading the survivors weighed heavily on him, and the lack of progress was disheartening. He knew that time was running out, that every passing hour brought them closer to the brink of disaster. He tried to keep the group focused, reminding them of the importance of staying together and conserving their energy. But the challenges were mounting, and the odds of survival were growing slimmer with each passing moment. The radio, their only link to the outside world, remained silent. The passenger tasked with operating it had tried every frequency, every channel, but there was no response. The batteries were almost dead, and it seemed increasingly unlikely that they would be able to make contact. The survivors began to wonder if anyone was even looking for them. The ditching had occurred in a remote part of the Pacific, far from shipping lanes and air traffic routes. The chances of being spotted by a passing ship or aircraft were slim, and the thought of being forgotten, of disappearing without a trace, was a haunting possibility. As the second day drew to a close, the survivors faced another long, cold night. The rafts were now showing signs of wear, their seams straining under the weight of the passengers. The ocean, though calm, was relentless. In its assault, salt water seeped into the rafts, soaking the survivors and making them even more uncomfortable. The cold was unbearable, and the lack of food and water was taking its toll. Some passengers began to hallucinate, their minds playing tricks on them in the darkness. Others slipped into a state of resignation, their will to survive fading with each passing hour. But amid the despair, there were glimmers of hope. The survivors banded together, sharing what little they had and offering comfort to one another. They told stories, sang songs, and tried to keep their spirits up. They knew that their survival depended not just on their physical strength, but on their ability to stay united and resilient. The ocean might be vast and unforgiving, but they were determined to fight for their lives, to hold on to the hope that rescue would come. As the third day dawned, the survivors faced a new challenge. A storm on the horizon, dark clouds gathered in the distance, and the wind began to pick up. The waves grew larger, tossing the rafts like toys in a bathtub. The storm was a double-edged sword. It could bring rain, which they desperately needed, but it could also capsize the rafts, ending their struggle for survival. The survivors braced themselves, clinging to the sides of the rafts as the storm approached. The ocean, once a silent adversary, now roared with fury, its waves crashing over the rafts and drenching the survivors. The storm was a test of their endurance, a reminder of the power of nature and the fragility of human life. But it was also a symbol of their resilience, their refusal to give up in the face of overwhelming odds. As the rain began to fall, the survivors tilted their heads back, letting the precious drops fill their mouths and quench their thirst. It was a small victory, but in their desperate situation, it felt like a miracle. The storm raged on, but the survivors held on, their determination unshaken. They knew that the fight for survival was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm descended upon the survivors with a ferocity that seemed almost personal, as if the ocean itself had decided to test their resolve. The once calm waters transformed into a churning maelstrom, waves rising like mountains before crashing down with enough force to shatter the fragile sense of order the survivors had managed to maintain. The life rafts, already strained from days of exposure, were tossed about like leaves in a hurricane. The wind howled, a deafening roar that drowned out all other sounds, and the rain fell in sheets, stinging their skin and reducing visibility. To mere feet, the survivors clung to the rafts and to each other, their bodies battered by the elements, but their spirits refusing to break. The storm lasted for hours, though to those enduring it, it felt like an eternity. The rafts were repeatedly submerged by the towering waves, only to resurface moments later, their occupants gasping for air and coughing up seawater. The cold was relentless, seeping into their bones and sapping what little strength they had left. The rain, while a welcome source of fresh water, was also a curse, as it made the rafts even more unstable and increased the risk of hypothermia. The survivors worked together, bailing water with their hands and whatever containers they could find, but it was a losing battle. The ocean was relentless, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Captain Mitchell, though weakened by dehydration and exhaustion, remained a steady presence. He shouted instructions over the wind, urging the survivors to hold on and stay together. His voice, though hoarse, carried a note of authority that helped keep panic at bay. He knew that if the group lost cohesion, their chances of survival would plummet. The storm was not just a physical challenge, it was a psychological one, a dégoût, test of their will to live, and so he focused on keeping them united, reminding them that they were stronger together than apart. As the storm raged on, the survivors faced moments of sheer terror. One of the rafts, overloaded and weakened by the constant battering, began to deflate. The passengers on board screamed as the raft listed dangerously to one side, threatening to capsize. Those on the other rafts could do little to help, as the waves made it impossible to maneuver. In a desperate bid to save themselves, the passengers redistributed their weight, shifting to the opposite side of the raft to counterbalance the tilt. It was a precarious solution, but it worked, for now. The raft remained afloat, though it was clear that it wouldn't survive much more punishment. The storm also brought with it a cruel irony. The rain provided much-needed fresh water, but collecting it was nearly impossible. The survivors cupped their hands and caught what they could, but the wind and waves made it difficult to gather more than a few mouthfuls. Some tried to use clothing or pieces of fabric to soak up the rainwater, wringing them out into containers, or directly into their mouths. It was a small victory, but in their desperate state, every drop counted. The rain also helped to rinse the salt from their skin and clothes, providing a brief respite from the constant irritation caused by the seawater. As the hours dragged on, the storm began to lose its intensity. The waves, though still formidable, grew less frequent, and the wind died down to a steady gust. The rain continued to fall, but it was no longer a deluge. The survivors, battered and exhausted, began to take stock of their situation. The rafts were still afloat, though they were in worse condition than before. Several had sustained damage, and one was barely holding. Together, the survivors themselves were in rough shape. Many were suffering from exposure, dehydration, and injuries sustained during the storm. But they had survived, and that in itself was a miracle. As the storm clouds began to disperse, the sun broke through, casting a pale, watery light over the scene. The ocean, once a raging beast, now seemed almost placid, as if ashamed of its earlier fury. The survivors, too exhausted to celebrate, simply sat in silence, their bodies trembling from the ordeal. The storm had taken a toll, both physically and emotionally, but it had also brought a strange sense of clarity. They had faced the worst that nature could throw at them and had come out the other side. It was a reminder of their resilience, of their determination to survive no matter the odds. In the aftermath of the storm, the survivors faced new challenges. The rafts were in dire need of repair, and the emergency supplies had been further depleted. The fresh water collected during the rain was a temporary relief, but it wouldn't last long. The survivors knew that they needed to find a way to signal for help, but their options were limited. The handheld radio was all but useless, its batteries drained and its range insufficient to reach anyone who might be searching for them. They had flares, but using them during the storm would have been futile, And now, with the skies clear, they had to decide when and how to deploy them. Captain Mitchell took charge once again, organizing the survivors into teams to address the most pressing issues. One group was tasked with repairing the rafts, using whatever materials they could scavenge. Another group was assigned to ration the remaining supplies, ensuring that everyone received a fair share. A third group was put on watch duty, scanning the horizon for any sign of ships or aircraft. It was a delicate balance, trying to conserve resources while also preparing for the possibility of rescue. The survivors knew that their time was running out, but they also knew that giving up was not an option. As the day wore on, the survivors began to notice changes in their environment. The color of the water seemed different, a deeper shade of blue that hinted at greater depths. Seabirds, which had been absent during the storm, began to appear, circling overhead and diving into the water in search of food. These were small signs, but they gave the survivors hope. Seabirds often meant that land was nearby, or at the very least, that they were in an area with more marine life. The possibility of finding food, fish, seaweed, anything, was a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. The survivors also began to notice debris from the aircraft floating in the water. Pieces of the fuselage, seats and luggage had been carried by the currents and were now scattered across the surface. While it was a grim reminder of the crash, it also provided an opportunity. The survivors salvaged what they could, using pieces of the wreckage to reinforce the rafts and create makeshift tools. They found a few unopened bottles of water and some packaged snacks, which were immediately added to their meager supplies. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going for a little longer. As the sun began to set, the survivors prepared for another night on the open ocean. The storm had left them battered but not broken, and they were determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They knew that rescue was their only hope, but they also knew that they couldn't rely on it. They had to be proactive, to do everything in their power to increase their chances of survival. And so, as the stars began to appear in the night sky, they took turns keeping watch, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of light or movement. The ocean was vast and unforgiving, but they were still alive, and that was enough to keep them going. The fourth day dawned with a quiet stillness that felt almost surreal after the chaos of the storm. The ocean, now calm and glassy, reflected the pale, pink and orange hues of the sunrise, creating a scene of breathtaking beauty that stood in stark contrast to the survivors' dire circumstances. The rafts, though battered and patched together with makeshift repairs, still floated, a testament to the ingenuity and determination of those on board. The survivors, however, were in increasingly poor condition. Dehydration and hunger had taken their toll, leaving them weak and listless. Their skin was sunburned and cracked, their lips dry and bleeding, and their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Yet despite their physical deterioration, their will to survive remained unbroken. The morning began with the now familiar routine of rationing the remaining supplies. The water collected during the storm had been carefully divided, each person receiving a few precious sips to stave off dehydration. The food, consisting of a handful of ration bars and a few salvaged snacks from the wreckage, was distributed with equal care. It was barely enough to keep them alive, but it was all they had. The survivors ate in silence, their movements slow and deliberate, as if conserving energy even in the simple act of chewing. The mood was somber, but there was also a sense of quiet determination. They had survived the storm, and that alone was a reason to keep going. Captain Mitchell, though weakened like the rest, continued to lead with a steady hand. He knew that maintaining order was crucial, especially as the days dragged on and hope began to wane. He organized the survivors into shifts, assigning tasks to keep everyone occupied and focused. Some were tasked with keeping watch for ships or aircraft, while others worked on repairing the rafts or tending to the injured. The work was slow and laborious, but it gave them a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting. Mitchell also made a point of checking in with each person, offering words of encouragement and reassurance. It was a small gesture, but in their isolated and desperate state, it meant everything. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat became almost unbearable. The survivors sought whatever shade they could find, using pieces of fabric or clothing to shield themselves from the relentless rays. The ocean, though beautiful, offered no relief. Its surface shimmered like a mirage, a cruel reminder of the water they couldn't drink. The salt water had become an ever-present torment, stinging their wounds and coating their skin with a gritty residue. Some of the survivors, driven to desperation, had tried to drink it, only to vomit it back up moments later. The lesson was a harsh one. The ocean, for all its abundance, was not their ally. Despite the challenges, there were moments of unexpected beauty and connection. Seabirds, their wings glinting in the sunlight, circled overhead, their cries a reminder that life persisted even in this desolate place. The survivors watched them with a mix of fascination and envy, marveling at their freedom and grace. Occasionally, a fish would leap out of the water, its silvery body catching the light before disappearing beneath the waves. These small glimpses of life were a source of comfort, a reminder that they were not entirely alone in this vast expanse. As the day wore on, the survivors began to notice changes in their environment. The color of the water had shifted to a deeper, richer blue, and the currents seemed to be carrying them in a new direction. Captain Mitchell, though no expert in oceanography, recognized these signs as possible indicators of a change in their location. He consulted the few navigational tools they had, a compass salvaged from the wreckage and a rough mental map of their last known position, and speculated that they might be drifting toward a shipping lane or an area with more marine traffic. It was a long shot, but it was enough to reignite a flicker of hope. The survivors also began to experiment with ways to catch fish. Using pieces of wire, string, and other scavenged materials, they fashioned crude fishing lines and hooks. The process was slow and frustrating, as the fish seemed to taunt them, swimming just out of reach. But eventually, their persistence paid off. A young passenger, his hands trembling with excitement, managed to hook a small fish. It wasn't much, but it was a victory, a sign that they could take control of their situation, even in some small way. The fish was carefully divided among the group, each person receiving a tiny portion. It was barely enough to taste, but it was a reminder that survival was possible, even in the harshest conditions. As the sun began to set, the survivors prepared for another night on the open ocean. The routine was familiar now. The careful rationing of supplies, the distribution of tasks, the quiet conversations that helped pass the time. But there was also a growing sense of anticipation. The changes in the water, the presence of seabirds, and the occasional glimpse of marine life had given them reason to believe that rescue might be closer than they thought. They knew better than to get their hopes up, but the possibility was enough to keep them going. That night, as the stars began to appear in the sky, one of the survivors on watch duty let out a cry. "Light!" they shouted, their voice cracking with excitement. "I see a light!" The others scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding as they followed the pointing finger. In the distance, barely visible on the horizon, was a faint glimmer of light. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was unmistakable, a ship or perhaps an aircraft moving steadily across the water. The survivors erupted into cheers, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Captain Mitchell quickly organized a plan, instructing the group to use their remaining flares to signal for help. The flares, though few in number, were their best chance of being seen. One by one, they were launched into the sky, their bright red light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The survivors watched with bated breath, their eyes fixed on the distant light, praying that it would turn toward them. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, slowly but surely, the light began to grow brighter. The ship, or whatever it was changing course, heading in their direction. The survivors clung to each other, their tears mixing with the salt water on their faces. For the first time in days, they allowed themselves to believe that rescue was possible, that their ordeal might soon be over. As the light drew closer, the survivors prepared themselves for what they hoped would be their salvation. They gathered their few belongings, checked on the injured, and made sure that everyone was ready to be evacuated. The mood was a mix of relief, disbelief, and lingering fear. They had come so far, endured so much, and now, finally, there was a chance that it might all be worth it. The ship, when it finally came into view, was a sight to behold. A large cargo vessel, its lights blazing like a small city on the water, approached slowly and deliberately. The survivors could see figures moving on the deck, preparing to lower a rescue boat. The sound of voices carried across the water a lifeline in the darkness. As the rescue boat drew nearer, the survivors felt a surge of emotions, relief, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. They had faced the unimaginable and had come out the other side. The ocean, once their prison, was now a pathway to freedom. And as they were pulled aboard the ship, wrapped in blankets and given water and food, they knew that they had done the impossible. They had survived. The rescue boat cut through the dark waters with a steady, purposeful rhythm, its engine a low hum that seemed almost soothing after days of silence and chaos. The survivors of Flight 714 watched its approach with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. Some wept openly, their tears mingling with the salt water on their faces, while others sat in stunned silence, unable to process the reality of what was happening. The ship's crew, clad in bright orange life vests and carrying flashlights, called out to them in a language that was foreign but comforting in its urgency. Hands reached out, pulling the survivors aboard one by one, their movements swift and efficient. The ordeal was not yet over, but the worst of it, the endless drifting, the gnawing hunger, the paralyzing fear, was finally behind them. The cargo ship, a massive vessel that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, was a stark contrast to the fragile life rafts the survivors had called home for the past several days. Its deck was a hive of activity, with crew members rushing to provide blankets, water, and medical attention. The survivors were guided to a makeshift triage area where they were assessed for injuries and signs of dehydration or hypothermia. The ship's medical team worked quickly but gently, their professionalism a balm to the survivors' frayed nerves. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the survivors were safe. They were no longer at the mercy of the ocean, no longer fighting for their lives with every passing moment. The realization was almost too much to bear. Captain Mitchell, though physically and emotionally drained, remained a steady presence among the survivors. He moved from person to person, offering quiet words of reassurance and gratitude. He knew that their survival was a collective effort, a testament to their resilience and determination. But he also knew that the journey was far from over. The trauma of the crash, the days adrift, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead would weigh heavily on all of them. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of quiet relief. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. As the survivors were settled into the ship's interior, they were given warm blankets and cups of water, small comforts that felt like luxuries after days of deprivation. The ship's crew, though busy with the logistics of the rescue, treated the survivors with kindness and respect, their actions speaking louder than words. The survivors, still in shock, struggled to articulate their gratitude. Some simply nodded, or whispered their thanks, while others clung to their rescuers, their emotions spilling over in a flood of tears and incoherent words. The language barrier was no obstacle. The shared humanity of the moment transcended words. The ship's captain, a grizzled man with a weathered face and a calm demeanor, approached Captain Mitchell and the other survivors. Through a translator, he explained that they had been spotted, by chance, their flares catching the attention of a crew member on watch. The ship had altered its course immediately, and though it had taken several hours to reach them, they had never given up hope. The survivors listened in silence, their gratitude too profound for words. They knew how close they had come to being, lost forever, how easily their flares could have gone unnoticed in the vastness of the ocean. The randomness of their rescue was both humbling and awe-inspiring. As the ship continued its journey, the survivors were given the opportunity to rest. They were shown to a large cabin filled with cots, its warmth and comfort a stark contrast to the harsh conditions they had endured. Many of them collapsed onto the cots, their bodies finally giving in to exhaustion. Others sat in small groups, talking quietly or simply holding hands, their bond forged in the crucible of survival. The atmosphere was one of quiet reflection, a collective processing of all they had been through. In the days that followed, the survivors began to regain their strength. The ship's crew provided regular meals, medical care, and even clothing to replace their tattered garments. The survivors, though, still haunted by their ordeal, began to smile and laugh again, their spirits lifted by the kindness of their rescuers. They shared their stories with one another, piecing together the events of the crash and the days that followed. They spoke of the storm, the fish they had caught, the moments of despair and hope that had defined their journey. These conversations were cathartic, a way of making sense of the chaos and finding meaning in their survival. Captain Mitchell, though grateful for the rescue, found himself grappling with a sense of guilt. He replayed the events of the flight in his mind, searching for answers, for something he could have done differently. The fuel anomaly, the rapid depletion, the desperate attempt to reach land. It all felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. He knew that an investigation would follow, that experts would analyze the data and determine what had gone wrong. But for now, he focused on the present, on the survivors who looked to him for guidance and reassurance. He knew that his role as their leader was not yet over. As the ship approached its destination, the survivors were informed that they would be transferred to a larger vessel equipped to handle their repatriation. The news was met with mixed emotions. While they were eager to return home, to reunite with their loved ones and begin the process of healing, they also felt a sense of trepidation. The world they were returning to was not the same as the one they had left. They had been changed by their experience, and the thought of facing the outside world again was both exciting and daunting. The transfer to the larger vessel was a smooth and well-coordinated operation. The survivors were escorted onto the new ship, where they were greeted by a team of medical professionals, counselors, and representatives from their respective countries. The atmosphere was one of efficiency and compassion, a reminder that their ordeal had not gone unnoticed. The survivors were given the opportunity to contact their families, a moment that brought both joy and tears. For many, it was the first time they had spoken to their loved ones since the crash, and the emotional weight of those conversations was overwhelming. As the larger vessel set sail, the survivors were provided with comfortable accommodations and access to counseling services. They were encouraged to rest and to take things one day at a time. The journey home would be long, but it was a journey they were ready to face. They had survived the impossible, and though the road ahead would be difficult, they knew they had the strength to endure. In the quiet moments, as the ship cut through the waves and the sun dipped below the horizon, the survivors found themselves reflecting on their experience. They thought about the ocean, its beauty and its cruelty, and the way it had tested them in ways they could never have imagined. They thought about the bonds they had formed, the friendships that had been forged in the crucible of survival. And they thought about the future, about the lives they would rebuild and the stories they would tell. The ordeal of Flight 714 would stay with them forever, a defining chapter in their lives. But it was also a reminder of their resilience, of the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. They had faced the abyss and had come out the other side, and that knowledge would carry them forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As the ship sailed on, carrying them toward home and healing, the survivors felt a sense of quiet hope. They had survived the ocean, and now they were ready to face the world again.